Good afternoon and welcome to the 39th Annual James C. Snyder Memorial Lecture. Thanks to all of you for being with us this afternoon, and honestly, thanks for all the things that you do to support the Department of Agricultural Economics throughout the entire year. We appreciate you being here, and I'm sure that you'll find this afternoon's lecture time well spent. I know you're anxious to hear the lecture, but I have a few formalities that we need to run through before we start. Dr. Jim Snyder was born on March 31st, 1930 in Ontario, Canada. He completed his bachelor's degree at the Ontario Agricultural College in 1953, after which he came to Purdue University for graduate study in agricultural economics. He obtained his Master of Science degree in 1956 and a doctoral degree in 1962. Jim Snyder demonstrated extraordinary initiative and creativity in his graduate research. He became excited about the potential use of management decision models for agribusiness. In recognition of the excellence of his research, Jim Snyder received the PhD Dissertation Award from the American Farm Economics Association, the first such award received by a Purdue student. Upon completion of graduate study, Jim became a member of the faculty in agricultural economics at Purdue and began a brilliant teaching and research career, attaining the rank of professor in 1969. He was named Teacher of the Year in recognition of his outstanding undergraduate instruction in business management. His pioneering research contributed greatly to the knowledge about the practical applicability of quantitative approaches to decision-making in the management of agribusiness firms. His design of functional programs for management decision-making is well known, and his consulting activities gave him insights and opportunities to make his work relevant to everyday business needs as well as to the training of his students. Jim Snyder was a master teacher of graduate students. He gave the type of personalized and rigorous training that qualified them for leading positions in business, education, and government. He made research exciting, and students responded with hard work, devotion, and admiration. Students wanted to work with Jim Snyder. Jim Snyder is remembered as a brilliant colleague whose work, standards, and style are a challenge to us all. Please join me in a moment of silent remembrance and contemplation of the life of Dr. Snyder and his accomplishments. We also take the opportunity of this day to recognize the accomplishments in our department and to recognize some key alumni and friends. For those of you who are familiar with today's celebration, you'll notice that we've reordered the program this year to accommodate the tight travel schedule of our distinguished speakers. Our awards program is scheduled for later this afternoon in the Crannard Auditorium, and I invite you all to attend that awards program. However, before we move to the lecture, I do want to recognize a key individual who's joined us this afternoon. It's truly an honor to have with us the late Dr. Snyder's wife, Mary Ruth Snyder. Mary Ruth, would you please stand so that we can show our appreciation? We'd also like to present a small token of appreciation to Mrs. Snyder. I'd be remiss, too, if I didn't take this opportunity to thank a couple of people who were instrumental in making today's event happen. Katricia Sanchez is the department's event coordinator, and she also coordinates events for the Center for Food and Ag Business. And my assistant, Debbie Weber, was instrumental in helping to promote today's activity. So, Katricia and Debbie, why don't you stand up and be recognized? The James C. Snyder Memorial Lecture is a signature event for the Department of Agricultural Economics at Purdue University. The lectures were established in February of 1975 as an appropriate memorial to a distinguished member of the faculty. Funds to support such a memorial are contributed by friends of the department who wish to encourage the continuation of the professional efforts of Jim Snyder during his brief but brilliant career. The purposes of these memorial lectures are to stimulate the intellectual environment of the department, to recognize the professional contributions of Professor Snyder, to contribute to the department's efforts to enhance and motivate excellence in all of its mission areas, and to broaden the perspective of students by exposing them to outstanding professionals from other institutions. This time it's my pleasure to invite University President and former Governor of the state of Indiana, Mitch Daniels, to introduce this year's Snyder Lecture speaker. President Daniels.
Thanks, Ken, and to all the people of the Department of Ag Econ. You know how proud we are of you and of the incredible tradition which you are continuing now. We were reminiscing last night. I don't think any one of us around a dinner table that included some of your longtime leadership could name all the alums who have served this nation in prominent capacities coming out of this department. We know that is a tradition that will continue in the students you are preparing now. And in the lineage of great public servants, we are graced today at Purdue by one of the finest of our time. You, I'm sure, know his bio or can read it, and I want to single out just a couple of the significant roles that he has played on behalf of us all. Bob Zoellich is, by any definition, one of the finest public servants America has produced in the last generation or two. And he has served in series in some of the most sensitive and important and delicate assignments anyone is asked to undertake. Let me just pick one of them for a moment. The Office of Trade Representative and the work of that office is, in some ways, I think, the most complicated and requires the greatest sophistication of any available in the federal government of the United States. It is the intersection of economics and politics and diplomacy. And it takes a person of consummate skill and broad understanding to hold it, let alone to hold it with distinction. This is someone who served brilliantly in that job and has brought the skills that he brought to that work to other equivalent and even larger assignments, and we'll bring in just a moment to the remarks that he's presenting here today. I'll just offer this personal thought in bringing Bob Zoellich to the podium at a moment of some very significant national danger. Of all the things I wish for, I can't name one that I wish for more earnestly than that Bob Zoellich were in a leadership position at this moment. He is the sort of person who has a track record of bringing people together, people of differing and disparate views, on the most complex of issues, whether they were trade negotiations or landmark legislation or complicated international business transactions, in a way that no one else I know can surpass. So it's with a great deal of pride on behalf of Purdue and a little personal pride in someone I consider a dear friend that I now share with you the wisdom of Ambassador and former Secretary Bob Zoellich.
Well, it's a particular honor to be invited to speak at this great university at an event that recognizes the special contributions of the late Professor James Snyder. And I'm especially pleased that Mary Ruth and I had a chance to join at lunch some of the talented students that are keeping on the tradition that he brought to this university. And it's a personal pleasure to be able to visit Purdue during the first year of the presidency of Mitch Daniels. Governor Daniels' excellent book, Keeping the Republic, has a glowing foreword written by George Will, who, like me, grew up in the Midwest, next door in Illinois. Now, it isn't so easy for Illini like the two of us to admit that during Governor Daniels' tenure, Hoosiers left our own home state in the dust, but so it is. In addition to my respect for and friendship with Mitch Daniels, I admire his outlook. Mitch's guiding principle is captured by the subtitle of that book, Serving America by Trusting Americans. and that is how he governed. As this audience knows well, America's higher education system, one of our country's crown jewels and great global advantages, is now being challenged to adapt to new technologies, changing consumer student demands, operating models, cost structures, research questions, teaching methods, and even bigger global shifts. And having watched Governor Daniels' transformation of state government and knowing of his national and private business experience, I believe President Daniels will press, gracefully, but courteously and persistently, the Purdue community to be global leaders. And in doing so, all of you will reflect the spirit and, I hope, the legacy of Professor James Snyder, too. When I was invited to speak to you today, I reached out to J.B. Penn, a friend and former colleague of mine when he served as the Undersecretary at the U.S. Department of Agriculture and I was the U.S. Trade Representative. J.B. had been a graduate student at Purdue when Dr. Snyder was a teacher. Professor Snyder, J.B. relayed to me, was a master teacher. Dr. Snyder was also a pioneer in examining the changing world of agriculture, looking far beyond the farm gate to input providers, processors, agribusiness, and consumers. While Dr. Snyder may have felt farming as a calling, he also analyzed agriculture quantitatively and as a business enterprise. Dr. Snyder changed how people thought, and that's a wonderful legacy. His examination of activities all across the value chain is especially important in appreciating change and opportunity, whether of universities or agricultural economics. Indeed, a little later, I'll speak to the value of Professor Snyder's methods today in understanding a major shift in global agriculture, driven significantly by the rise of developing countries. Now, Purdue is just the place to talk about economic and institutional transformations because the very origins of this university reflect one such great advance in American history. Even as Abraham Lincoln of Indiana and Illinois preserved the Union during the Civil War, his young Republican Party was looking ahead. In 1862, the 37th Congress passed a striking and innovative array of legislation that set the U.S. economy on a path to global greatness. The Homestead Act of May 1862, which offered each American family 160 acres of land if the homesteaders would work their farm for 5 years, building a nation of enterprising property holders. The Morrill Act of that July, which granted land to states that would endow agricultural universities, fostering education, the practical arts, and eventually our world-class land-grant research centers. And the first Pacific Railway Act, also passed in July 1862, which encouraged the use of lands for a monumental engineering, transportation, and economic venture, the Transcontinental Railway. Now, the 37th Congress also authorized greenbacks in 1862. So from now on, whenever you open your wallets, you can remember the amazing 37th Congress. Now, Purdue itself was created by and has contributed to these far-sighted ideas and measures. In 1865, the Indiana General Assembly voted to take advantage of the Morrill Act, and with the generosity of John Purdue, founded a new College of Science, Technology, and Agriculture. Rather than follow the path of the classical universities, Purdue's President Emerson White wanted the school to combine a liberal education with engineering, industrial, and agricultural sciences. Purdue's first degree, a Bachelor of Science in Chemistry, was conferred in 1875. And that was the year that this very modern university wisely began to admit women students, a full 45 years before women won the right to vote under the U.S. Constitution. As America grew and changed, so did Purdue, adding new testing facilities for locomotives and better steam engines, the first four-year degree in aviation, first university airport, the first computer science department in the U.S., and on to spaceflight technology with its 23 graduate astronauts who earned Purdue the nickname Cradle of Astronauts. Coming full circle from the policy of innovation in the 1860s, in 2010, Purdue launched a Global Policy Research Institute to explore the connections between technology, knowledge, and public policy. Now, there's one other aspect of today's Purdue that especially caught my eye. According to the Institute of International Education, in 2012, Purdue had the fourth largest international student population of all U.S. universities. So today, in the spirit of Purdue's origin and Professor Snyder's legacy, I'd like to talk first about a big shift in the global economy, then comment about the effect on global agriculture, and close with a few observations about the implications for the United States. In 2010 and 11, China alone consumed roughly 64% of the world's cement, 58% of the iron ore, about 45% of the coal, steel, and lead. And for the Aggies among you, China consumed 44% of the world's pigs, 40% of the eggs, and 27% of the soybeans. Now pause to consider those numbers. They're absolutely huge. Of course, some of the figures will adjust as China is built, but India and others are still to follow. In the decade before the financial crisis, sub-Saharan Africa grew 5 to 6% a year and is now back on that growth trajectory. Over the past 5 years, about 2/3 of global growth came from developing countries. And as recently as the 1990s, that percentage contribution was below a quarter or a fifth. Over the past decade, U.S. exports to developing countries increased from 25% to 50% of total U.S. exports. Developing countries now control about 70% of the world's financial reserves. And as a result of all these changes, last year, global economic output was, for the first time, split evenly between developed and developing countries. Now, what I'm describing is a shift. It's not a specific forecast. Each market has to be considered individually, and many, including China, faced major challenges of reform. So here's my broader point. The nature of the world economy is shifting, and it's doing so quickly. In addition to the pattern of recovery from the Great Recession, we need to keep our eye on the major structural shifts in the dynamics of the world economy. And these changes will have a host of implications. For the first time in my experience, all the major advanced economies are stumbling along, significantly below their potential growth. So developing countries will need structural changes to focus more on domestic demand, whether consumption, public services, or urban investment in China, or investment in infrastructure in Latin America and South and Southeast Asia. Now let's dig a little deeper into the effects of these structural shifts. For example, China's urbanization rate is likely to increase from 50% today to about 70% by 2030. South Asia's urbanization is likely to increase from 30% today to 55% by 2050. Now, urbanization involves a lot of building, of course, but even more importantly, changes in societies, interaction, economies, and the environment. Moreover, many of Asia's cities are on low-lying coasts, so climate change and natural disasters pose special challenges. Earlier this year, I met with the senior management team of a major multinational headquartered in Europe. Although known historically for its engineering and manufacturing, this company is now organized to focus on urbanization, intelligent infrastructure investment, efficient and clean use of energy, and more competitive and innovative industrial services. Now, this could be a good fit for the changing structure of growth in China, and I suspect elsewhere. On a visit I had to Beijing last December, it was clear to me that the new premier, Li Keqiang, will use urbanization as a neutral term to highlight some of the broader structural reforms that China faces. The rising weight of developing countries will have implications for South-South trade, but also for investment, currencies and exchange rates, remittances, tourism, development, logistics and supply chains, and business models. Since South-South barriers are generally higher than North-South barriers, there are significant potential gains if these restrictions can be overcome. We're going to see more South-North patterns too, including in investment. China's go-out strategy for external investment is a leading example of this change. But developing economies face big challenges too. A report that the World Bank produced with China last year, titled China 2030, highlights the risks of the so-called middle income trap, which is the tendency of productivity and growth to slow as countries reach middle income levels. Of the 101 economies that the World Bank had categorized as middle income in 1960, by 2008, almost 50 years later, only 13 had made it to high income, and one was Greece. Now, you'll hear more about this challenge of overcoming the middle income trap from leaders in emerging markets, but it also offers some opportunities for policies and businesses that can boost productivity, whether through public-private partnerships for infrastructure, education and skills development for human capital, or service sector competitiveness. The increasing importance of developing economies also poses a challenge to the very international system that was created after World War II and modified over the next 65 years. In effect, this was a trilateral system, led by the U.S., but supported over time by the European Union and Japan. But the advanced economies, now under stress and facing tougher competition, want developing economies to assume more responsibility. And while some larger developing countries recognize their shared systemic interests with the bigger advanced economies, they understandably also point to their limitations. The so-called middle-income countries are home to 75 to 80% of the people still living on incomes of less than $2 a day. So while the middle-income countries reasonably want more of a say, some are reluctant to assume the full systemic responsibilities. I became the U.S. Trade Representative in 2001, was Deputy Secretary of State in 2005, worked at Goldman Sachs globally in 2006 and 2007, and then spent the past 5 years as President of the World Bank Group. Now, 11 years is a blink of an eye in historical terms, but I could see stresses in the international system for trade, investment, development, commodities, including agriculture, currency and exchange rates, intellectual property, and the environment. And these shifts in power and reach and interests will inevitably affect the global security architecture too. So what might be the implications of these changes for world agriculture, drawing on the method of analysis offered by James Snyder? I think farming, agribusiness, and related topics such as nutrition are also in the midst of a huge shift. This transformation has major implications for growth, hunger and nutrition, development, overcoming poverty, R&D and technology, business opportunities, investment, and the environment. Yet the possibilities and the dislocations are not well appreciated by the public, by opinion leaders and policymakers, and perhaps even by the agricultural and food industry itself. From 1960 to roughly the end of the century, the story of world agriculture seemed to be one of increasing production and declining prices. Staples production increased 166% over 50 years, and real prices for wheat, for example, fell 62%. Agriculture in developed economies was marked by farm consolidation and increased technological sophistication. Farmers in developing economies didn't get much attention. Yet a closer look reveals that important changes had already started to take place to reshape this old trend. Grain consumption expanded steadily from 1996, and agricultural production struggled to keep pace. Biofuels added a new major source of demand. By early in the last decade, grain stocks-to-use ratios had fallen, and by 2006 and 2007, the buffers were razor thin. By this January, there was only 67 days of grain supply in the pipeline, up a little from the earlier low point of 55 days. In these conditions, the effects of weather variability on production forecasts and on prices are greatly amplified. But it's understandable that people are asking, are these conditions part of a new long-term trend, or is this just a commodity boom that will fade? Here's my view. I think that world agriculture is facing powerful, interconnected structural shifts. Start with changes in population, incomes, and urbanization. In 2000, Earth was home to 6.1 billion people. We have 7 billion today. Expect to reach 8 billion in 2025 and over 9 billion by 2050. And most important, as we discussed in a panel this morning, the population growth will be most rapid where diets are least adequate, and the income growth will be most rapid in the most populous regions. We're already seeing major dietary shifts in developing countries. There are forecasts that meat consumption will at least double for China, India, and Africa by 2030. Taken together, the FAO estimates farmers will need to produce 50% more food by 2050, and if one considers all agricultural output, a broader measure of farm activity, supply will need to grow 70 or even 100%. Yet, and this is a key point, constraints on greater production from land, water, climate change in the environment, labor and societal pressures are already tightening. Most of the world's total arable land is already in use. The remaining land faces soil and terrain constraints such as infertility and toxicity, hilly and difficult ground, forests and protected areas, and human and animal diseases. Other lands require significant infrastructure investments. Irrigation increases yields of most crops by 2 to 4 times, but agriculture already accounts for 70% of the world's freshwater consumption, 90% in China and India. By 2025, 1.8 billion people will live in areas of absolute water scarcity, and 2/3 of all people will live in water-stressed areas. Under business-as-usual policies, the World Bank estimated a 40% gap between water supply and demand by 2030. 80% of the new tropical agricultural land in the last decade came from clearing forests, a huge loss of wildlife habitat, biodiversity, cultural landscape, and greenhouse gas absorption. This huge structural shift, a big ongoing increase in the demand for nutritious food, combined with contractions of the traditional means of expanding production, points to the policy imperative, the vital need to increase productivity. We need to expand output with significantly less intrusion. Now, we've seen big increases in agricultural productivity in developed economies through better management, machinery, genetics. Yet the big opportunities and needs are now in developing economies. If Professor Snyder were here, I suspect he'd point to the principal challenge. We need to increase productivity all across the value chain in developing economies. Equally important, there needs to be a new push for open agricultural trade to facilitate the movement of food from surplus producers to major consuming centers. But even with this structural trend, another question bears asking. What can cause significant deviations around this new course? Because volatility and uncertainty increase risk to farmers and investors, especially the small producers. I believe policymakers, perhaps even some market participants, have not yet fully recognized the potential market volatility in this new era of world agriculture. And let me just pose one example shared with me by my friend J.B. Penn, who's now the chief economist of John Deere. As Dr. Penn explained to me, given the small carryover stocks for corn, the price of a bushel of corn might be $4 or $10 within just 45 days, depending largely on near-term weather conditions. On the supply side, Dr. Penn has pointed out that the primary sources of marginal soy or grain exports are now shifting to regions where production traditionally has been less stable: Argentina, Brazil, Australia, the Black Sea region. On the demand side, China has emerged as a major soy importer over the past decade, but it eased back from the global market for wheat and corn. But China's corn imports are now edging up. What if China becomes a large importer of corn too? My policy point is that we need to expect that the new normal will be one of continued uncertainty and volatility around the new trend line of growth. National trade restrictions on food exports exacerbate this vulnerability. Both businesses and governments will need to consider the availability of tools, from safety nets for the most vulnerable to financing and hedging techniques to help manage these risks. Given this structural change in agriculture and the volatility around the trend line, what are the business and policy opportunities and necessities? When I worked with our private sector agricultural team at the World Bank Group, we used a value chain approach. First, to strengthen the investment climate with attention to land tenure, including for women, regulation for provision of security and streamlined customs procedures, then adding to infrastructure, including permitting private concessions for storage, irrigation, and transport. Of course, agribusiness needs reliable, efficient input producers and distributors, delivering seeds, fertilizers, chemical, farm equipment, micro irrigation. We also need traders, distributors, and retailers, especially with backward linkages to smallholders through the provision of finance, extension, and ecosystem services. Agribusiness needs strong financial intermediaries to assist with risk sharing in management, warehouse receipts, and trade finance. We also need to invest in advisory and ecosystem services, covering farmers, small and medium-sized enterprises, communities, environmental and social standards, and corporate governance. And we need particular attention to the challenges of smallholders and rural women. We learned that with partnerships with civil society and expert groups, we could actually lower risks, improve transparency, and boost connections to nutrition, environmental sustainability, and public health. Overall, we estimated that the investment need would be about $80 billion a year, most of which would have to come from the private sector. Now, public policies also have to adapt to this new outlook for agriculture. Governments can help integrate technology into farms and agribusiness through monitoring, evaluation, planning, for example, through remote sensing, GPS, GIS, and long-range weather forecasting. Food safety must be improved, of course, for home consumption and certainly exports. Trade policies should encourage imports and exports, supported by a stronger agricultural market information system. Of course, all these changes matter most through their effects on people, especially farmers. In a conversation that I had last year, shortly before I left the World Bank, with Agnes Kalibata, the impressive woman who's Rwanda's agricultural minister, encapsulates the potential for me. Minister Kalibata recounted how the World Bank had created a rapid response program, and that first enabled Rwanda to be able to buy and deliver valuable inputs in 2008, so farmers in Rwanda could actually plant seeds and fertilizers when they were hard to obtain. Then, she said, a year or two later, the bank helped Rwanda with hillside irrigation and terracing, and it doubled the farmers' productivity. And now, she concluded, the World Bank's private sector arm, IFC, is helping to draw private investment to Rwanda's food storage business so the added produce won't be lost and can be managed for higher incomes. And that brings me to my concluding thought about this transformation in world agriculture. I'm concerned that the farm policies in the U.S. are out of step with the structural changes that I've outlined today. U.S. farm policies have grown increasingly defensive. They're rooted in a logic from a different era. They don't recognize the growing importance of the global food trade given this new outlook. Sure, U.S. farm exports and incomes have increased, but if you look and disaggregate, the gains are generally coming from higher prices and ethanol demand, not from boosting share in growing markets. Most people are surprised to learn that U.S. grain export volumes are stagnant to declining. Now, the farm subsidies of the past will be harder to justify as fiscal pressures build. We should be looking to the demands of the future, which are more likely to lead to periodic shortages than the chronic surpluses of the past. We should be reducing barriers to agricultural trade, not holding on to protections of the past that are ill-suited for today. We should be investing in climate-smart agriculture, focusing on adaptation, resilience, and soil carbon solutions. There's also much experience and know-how that U.S. agriculture can bring to other markets about building integrated, cost-effective value chains with high standards. This new agriculture era should be defined by the reliance on scientific method and evidence, innovation, customization and adaptation to the growing and developing markets, use of IT and software, work across related sectors such as nutrition, the environment and conservation, good governance, education and training, and public health. This is an exciting agenda, a growth opportunity, an entrepreneurial challenge, a global necessity, and it certainly fits Purdue very well. So finally, what are the implications of these global shifts for the United States? Well, Europe is weighed down with the serious challenges of the Eurozone and the burden of a social welfare state that it can no longer afford. Japan is struggling to overcome demographic decline, deflation, and the devastation of natural and nuclear disasters. Of the major advanced economies, the countries that guided the international system for the past 65 years, only the United States is positioned to lead in creating a new international economic, political, and security system that can integrate the emerging economies as responsible stakeholders in this system. America's power of innovation remains very strong, as the turnaround in the country's energy development has demonstrated once again. Software creations from Silicon Valley and elsewhere are, in the words of Mark Andreessen, the founder of Netscape, eating the world. And his point is that software is revolutionizing sector after sector in businesses that we've viewed primarily in terms of the physical world. America's demographics are better than Europe's, Japan's, Russia's, or for that matter, China's, especially if we can find our way to an economically sensible, politically acceptable, and humane immigration reform. Yet there is a shadow looming over these prospects, and Mitch Daniels has been one of the most lucid and sensible in describing it. Put simply, our generations are adding a back-breaking burden to the young Americans who will have to lead in this changed world. Today's federal spending on so-called entitlement programs, ranging from health to pensions, now costs every man, woman, and child in America over $7,400 every year. And that bill is growing. When the World Bank worked with Chinese reformers to design new safety net systems for health and pensions and workers, we reviewed experience from around the world with our Chinese colleagues. And I was struck that the Chinese officials, members of the Communist Party, mind you, told my World Bank colleagues that China wanted to stay clear of rigid, overly expensive European and perhaps American social welfare models. The Chinese communists couldn't afford European socialism. The Chinese preferred to work with ideas such as workfare and flexicurity that would link income support to individuals, not to bureaucracies, to foster flexible labor markets and highlight incentives for adaptation in work. Now, we've seen a number of the U.S. state governments, including Indiana's, start to drive these structural reforms for schools, jobs, efficient services, pensions, even public-private partnerships for infrastructure. If our national government faced up to such challenges, it would also strengthen America's ability to help shape the changing international system I've described. And that agenda will be very important for future opportunity, growth, security, and liberty in a world that is changing very quickly. I think Purdue University can play a leading role in this era of transformation, just as it did for the new American experiment launched by Abraham Lincoln in the midst of our country's greatest trial of existence. We are again living through one of those hinge points of history, this time of global history. And the direction that America swings will be very important, not only for Americans, but for the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. We're going to have more than a half an hour for questions, and the audience, I hope, has come prepared with some. I've been asked to pose the first one or two, and so let me start by going back on the air. It's green. Is this still broadcasting? Mr. Ambassador, it's been read that it's been written recently that maybe mankind has seen its last war, its last international war at least. My question to you is, can we hope that we've entered such a period? if not, if there is a next major war, where and why?
Well, I think we'd all prefer an environment of peace and security, but all you have to do is read the newspapers and see that there are trouble spots all around the world. I think some of these may not even fit traditional definitions of war and conflict, but an event like Syria is not only devastating to the people of Syria, but it will clearly have overflow on neighbors, whether with Iraq or Turkey or Lebanon, and depending what comes out of it, could also affect the homeland of the United States. So I think we need a concept of security that expands beyond the traditional conflicts. And in fact, even in the nature of these comments, as you start to think about some of the stress points for water and climate and agriculture, you have tensions that could lead people into conflict or into desperate actions. On the other hand, and I've tried to do some work in my life trying to connect economic security, one needs to think about how some of these other changes might create other major shifts. So we've just seen Lady Thatcher pass away, and she's associated with the end of the Cold War with Ronald Reagan and dealing with Mikhail Gorbachev. For all the efforts that were done in terms of strengthening the Western position in NATO and dual-track missiles and other issues, I think one also has to look at the price of oil falling to $15 to $10 a barrel and its effect on Gorbachev and his recognition that the economic system of the Soviet Union couldn't keep up. But to look ahead, you have today in Korea a very uncertain situation. You have a new leader there that, frankly, people don't know whether he's following through his father's and grandfather's playbook. That playbook tended to be to create threats, to try to get people to give North Korea things that otherwise wouldn't get. But one of the things, I think anybody who's been in public service, and certainly you've seen this and I've seen this, I never underestimate the danger of miscalculation, too. People get too close to the line, all of a sudden the dogs of war, things get unleashed that you can't totally predict. I think what we'll see in the years ahead is a focus in the United States, where as a country that is weary of war and conflict, that will try to figure out how to position ourselves with our basic global and economic interests. For example, the security of the western part of Eurasia, South Asia, the East Asia. So these are some of the traditional alliance and economic relationships, the traditional notion that you wouldn't want any one power to be dominant on Eurasia, whether it had been the Soviet Union or whether it had been Hitler's Germany. And I think you'll see a move back from some of the land operations that we've struggled with over the past decade. I think even as we deal with those sort of issues, and this will have questions, for example, for President Obama and Secretary Hagel at a time of budget stringency about what will be the force posture and position of the United States in alliance relationships. I think cybersecurity is going to be a critical issue, and that covers everything from traditional espionage to sort of commercial stealing to kind of its use in war and conflict. So I guess as I would step back, I would say that the forces and dangers in the world remain, as they've been in the past, something you just can't take for granted. On the other hand, if you step back and listen to the story that I just mentioned, what great opportunities. I mean, even when sort of you and I were sort of first going into government, who would have thought that 2/3 of global growth would be coming from countries we used to call the third world? Mm-hmm. When I was at the World Bank, I banished the term third world because I thought with the end of the Soviet Union, which was the second world, they should have at least moved up one, right? But in reality, they didn't want to be considered the third world. That's just a derivative. That's not how they see themselves. And so I think part of my larger message is I find changes and shifts to create sort of risks, but also opportunities. And whether it's a university or whether it's a country. And I find this to be a rather exciting time in terms of some of the opportunities.
It's 2025. Is there a euro? And if so, how many countries is it remaining?
Oh, that's a tricky one. I believe there will be a euro. I'm less certain about the exact number of countries. I think actually some will try to join by then. But, you know, in trying to understand what's going on more broadly in the Eurozone, the European Union, I think it's useful to recognize you've got three interconnected problems here. One is a problem of sovereign debt, as we have in the United States as well. Another is a problem of weakness of the banking system. And those two are interconnected because if the banks hold the sovereign debt and the value of the sovereign debt falls, well, then the bank's capital falls. And then third, for some countries, you have a basic competitiveness problem. Would they be able to compete in the world economy? And what we've seen in Europe, in a different way than in the United States, is the European Central Bank has bought time. So the actions, particularly last summer, of Mario Draghi, who's a superb individual, calmed some of the markets for sort of Spain and Italy. But that doesn't deal with the fundamentals. The fundamentals still have to address these three categories. And I think at this point, the real challenge will be the politics of reform. This is where political economy comes back in that it's very difficult to do the things that I described in a no-growth or low-growth environment. It's hard enough to do them if you're growing. And so, you know, I'll give people an example. I was at an event with German CEOs and policymakers earlier this year. They invited the Greek Prime Minister, and he gave a pitch about the reforms he was making. And I asked him afterwards, I said, you know, it's very interesting, Prime Minister Samaras, but so how long do you think you have? And he said, I have to start to show a turnaround by the end of the year because I got populism rising on the left and the right. He said, I don't know where they're getting the money, but some of this Golden Dawn party, this semi-fascist party, provides food to people in villages. So you can see the strains of that system. I think the Greeks and the Cypriots and the smaller ones can be managed. The big issue will be Italy and Spain, and in this case, whether with a change of Italian government, they continue to the reform process. And the one to really watch is France, because traditionally in the creation of Europe, the Franco-German relationship was very, very important. And so the issue is, will France become part of the solution or part of the problem? And then, of course, it all comes back down to Germany. And here, I've had a little bit of a contrarian view with most Americans. I think most Americans looked at the euro and the Eurozone through the eyes of simply the economics. They say, why would the Germans pay for this? I worked on German unification. I have a close sense of the country. I've always felt that the Germans are much more deeply committed to European integration than Americans might understand from their politics. But political leaders also have to deal with their publics. And I think the German public will support this as long as others are seen to continue to try. They may not be totally successful, but they continue to try. And so this brings you right back to the politics of reform. And I think it's most likely than not that they muddle through and stumble through. But as for your question about numbers, I'll share with you another particular example. Chancellor Merkel had said at this public gathering, so I can say it here, that she and her colleagues were ready to let Greece go late last year, but they were convinced that the damage to the rest of the Eurozone was too great. Now that brings you back to the banking issue. You know, if people feel that a euro in one country is not the same as a euro in another country, then you run the risk of illiquidity, a Lehman moment. And so therefore, you know, if you built in the deposit insurance, if you build in the bank supervision, you'll be better able to sustain those. Europe isn't quite there yet.
Is the audience ready? Dr. Tyner.
As a master negotiator,
Wally, you got to tell who you are. So.
Wally Tyner, it seems to me one of the biggest challenges in international negotiation is climate change, because you have the big diversity of interest between the rich and the poor, and the huge enormity of the problem. How would you suggest that we try to move forward, or should we, in those international climate negotiations?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And just to show you that there's no stone that I haven't turned over trying to do some job, I actually was the person in charge of the Rio agreement that was sort of done in 91 and 92. I was at the Copenhagen meeting, which was extremely dispiriting. And afterwards, some of you may recall, the next meeting was in Cancun, Mexico. And I went to see President Calderon of Mexico, who is a wonderful partner. And by the way, the partnership between Canada, the United States, and Mexico is still an untapped wealth for us. I suggested to him an approach to taking the Cancun meeting, and this is the way to try to address your issue. The UNFCCC, which is the forum for these negotiations, keeps trying to do this with 195 plus countries, with all items, all at once, and it would make Gosplan embarrassed in terms of the lack, the degree of global planning. What I had suggested to President Calderon was to say, look, let's try to build some critical mass around individual building blocks. And there's actually an international legal basis for this. If you go back to the Rio Treaty, countries are supposed to develop national action plans. And while the UN high priest didn't always like this, I said, well, what's to stop 150 countries from having a combined national action plan on avoided deforestation, or 160 countries to do it on energy efficiency, or 140 countries to do something in soil carbon, or some other things in technology, and some other things in island adaptation. So my point was, you can actually make progress through each of these areas and show practical changes on the ground that make a difference, whether it's in mitigation or adaptation. As a matter of international negotiation, I then went to see Calderon sort of the week of his final meeting, and through his team, he had an integrated team of the finance, energy, environment ministries, so on and so forth. They were doing a wonderful job. And I said, Mr. President, I said, you're doing a great job with all this. I said, but have your lawyers look up the definition of consensus. I said, because you probably think that consensus means everybody. But international law has variations of meanings. And I said, consensus doesn't necessarily have to mean everybody. And I said, as the week goes on, you might discover that some country, maybe Bolivia, decides it wants to hold you up because you're putting everything together. And that's exactly what happened, and they basically kind of overruled Bolivian the consensus, which is why I am now the proud honor of the Aztec eagle of the Mexican government for my diplomacy. I can't do it for the U.S., but I do it for Mexico. But I think the lesson there is, from whether it's the practical efforts of trying to get experience on the ground and develop things, and then get the feedback loops. And so it's not just a matter of negotiations, it's the learning. And I touched on one of these in our prior session. Avoided deforestation was something that 10 years ago people kind of knew was a good idea. They thought it might absorb 17% of the greenhouse gases. But how do you monitor it? How do you make sure if they preserve these trees, they don't cut down the trees somewhere else? What do you do with the indigenous people? So on and so forth. These are practical issues people have to deal with. And the bank was trying to help address those. I think soil carbon, I won't go into all the details, is another potential one, but the question is, how do you measure it? How do you make sure that the practices fit the standards? How do you get the support? And I think the more you build these pieces, the more that you can create a generalized interest, because at the level of real sort of international strategy, this is one of those core issues like trade or others that I was referring to in my remarks of the developing and developed economies. Developing economies say, well, wait a minute, we didn't cause this problem. Why should we contribute to this? We created some climate investment funds at the World Bank. I got about $7 billion worth of contributions. We leveraged it through our other resources to about $50 billion. We did projects in 45 countries. Every one of those countries that we did, it might be energy efficiency with a transport system, whatever, they would build support and interest in trying to do this. And this brings me to the last point. One of the things that President Bush 43 launched late in his administration, and it was unfortunate. It was too late, and so it was kind of tarred. And frankly, when he rejected Kyoto, which I think he should have rejected because Kyoto had the advanced economies only being responsible, not the developing countries, would have been a good time for him to launch this. He launched something called the Major Economies Initiative. And what it basically amounts to is, if you can get about 25 to 30 tops of certain economies in the world to get themselves together on this, you can really address a lot of the core issues. They have to be willing to do it together, but so China and the US obviously being important. So the reason I've explained a little bit is that this is a sort of classic of some of the things that we were even talking about in the other context with agriculture. It's partly institutional. It's partly power politics. It's partly diplomacy. It's partly technology. It's partly practical experience on the ground. And how do you interconnect those in a way? And the problem is on too many of these international issues, people sort of deal with them as if they're just theology, that have to work in a certain UN framework. And you see, my career has been in kind of an unusual one in that I've sort of worked at the national level, but I also how to make multilateralism work in a modern, practical way. And climate change will be sort of challenge number one in doing that.
Back on the aisle.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. First of all, great comments today, and I served on your APAC Advisory Committee with you and Alan Johnson and J.B. Penn. My real question is, as we look through the free trade agreements, and we've talked about them, you got a Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement working, we got an EU agreement working or trying to be. How do we achieve and get those through Congress? International agriculture is a big international trade believer, but our stumbling block a lot of times is our own U.S. Congress. Any thoughts?
Well, I'm a big believer in trying to open up markets. I think when we talk about, Mitch asked me about the European Union, part of it was structural reform and competitiveness. Trade can be a driver of this. It can be very important for the success of what Japan is trying to do, and obviously it's good for our own economy as well. So trade can be certainly a driver of economic reform, but you have to master the politics. So while I support them in concept, and strategically the relations with Europe and Asia and Japan can be very important in this rising power shifts, I also am sort of a practical person about trying to get stuff done, okay? And the question number one is, I hope the administration is very committed to this. I'm not trying to sound partisan on it, but in the first term they were pretty sluggish in even passing the 3 free trade agreements that they had inherited, 2 of which I had done, and I left that office in 2005. We don't have a U.S. trade representative today. It's kind of hard to negotiate agreements if you don't have the cabinet job filled. I mean, this one is just behind OMB in terms of standing and stature and the rank. But so I used to fall behind the OMB director and trying to follow him into various meetings. But you still need one. Now, I think each of these agreements you have to take a little bit on separate terms. And I'll just say, in the case of the transatlantic, there are going to be 2 big challenges. One is, as we discussed a little bit this morning, agriculture is very important to our trade agenda because we've got a lot of ag states. That means you've got a lot of senators that are interested in agriculture. And the U.S. farm experience with Europe has not been a pleasant one. So we negotiate open markets for beef. It's blocked by hormones. Poultry is blocked by chlorine. Grains is blocked by biotech. So the point is, I don't believe that those are irresolvable problems. They're not going to be perfect solutions, but you're going to need somebody that has a closer's mentality and is backed by political will, and that will be the challenge. The second is, beyond tariffs and quotas, which aren't the biggest obstacles in the U.S. transatlantic or European context, you're going to have what they call the regulatory agenda. And Mitch knows this from his experience at both the state and the federal level. These are devilishly difficult to be able to try to get common standards. You could try to get mutual recognition. My suggestion as a way to get some momentum for the transatlantic agreement, it's a little novel, but the United States negotiated a free trade agreement with Korea. The European Union did a slight variation of that agreement. It's a derivative, and they passed one. So why not take the U.S.-Korean and Korean-European FTAs and say, well, here's kind of the baseline that we'll work from, and then focus on some of these other particular issues. In the case of the Trans-Pacific, the part of the challenge is with about half those countries, more than half, we already have free trade agreements. So the question is, what is the administration really going to try to do in terms of increasing standards? With some, this is where, as Mitch was kind enough to say, trade negotiation is actually an interesting challenge. On the one hand, you have to be strategic. On the other hand, you have to have a political and commercial sense for America. So I first think New Zealand, dairy. Okay, and so, what's the dairy industry in the United States? It's changed a little bit since I've been into it. You got a competitive part and a less competitive part. But how are you going to bring these sort of pieces together? And again, without getting into all the details, I think also, particularly if Japan comes in, this could be historically important, but you got to have somebody who's willing to drive it forward and close it. I would say this in a larger context. You hear a lot of talk about, partisanship and Congress not being able to work together. You touched a little bit on that. This is an issue you could get bipartisan support. The Republicans have been very pro-trade on these topics. I'm going to be talking to the House Ways and Means Republicans in a couple weeks about these issues. So, but ultimately it depends on whether we translate talk into action. And I guess I'll close on that point, because having been involved with public policy, but the private sector and others, what I find distinguishes the sort of those that really matter versus the rest is that people that don't just talk, but people who figure out how to close, get things done, deliver things. And there's not as much attention to that as there should be.
Got one over here. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Good afternoon, Ambassador Zoll. If I may ask a question regarding issues that one could get a broad agreement on, renewable energy and use of it to address all of the above, maybe one way to go there. Would you care to comment on that?
Well, sure, if you can ask any question you want. If it's too hard, I'll pass it to the governor here. Well, I think, renewable energy, I think is a hot topic. It's a question of how people, sort of a combination of, how they see the costs, to what degree do they insist on subsidies, kind of how to build in some of the, sometimes the structural changes that one needs for renewable energy. We were talking about ethanol in the context of our agricultural discussion, and there's obviously some sensitivities about the effect of that on corn or sugar use and on food prices. My own view on ethanol was that I could understand you have some initial interest in trying to help create incentives for infrastructure, but if we have a policy combination of a mandate to use it, a subsidy for it, and then a tariff to block it coming in, that struck me as inconsistent. Now, the good news is we've changed some of that. And so, the question will be kind of whether it can stand on its own given energy prices for the future. In areas such as solar, I'm not an expert. From the people I talk to, I get a sense that with some of the development, you can actually drive down, and some of the technology, you can drive down the costs considerably. And so when I was at the World Bank, we were trying to invest in some solar projects and others, particularly in North Africa, that could be economically beneficial, but also meet the European sort of standards for renewable technologies. So I think, as in a lot of types of problems, I don't think there's sort of only one answer. It depends on how you're going to price some of the externalities of the current base system. And, with the huge change in natural gas that we've seen, we'll see how that proceeds. You may have some changed sort of cost patterns compared to some of the renewables.
Have another on the aisle. We did have one down here.
Danny from Illinois. Little guy.
Where are you from in Illinois?
Near Gibson City, kind of by Bloomington, Illinois.
How do you feel here among all these Hoosiers? Is it okay?
Not too bad.
He traded up. What are you talking about?
The taxes are lower. I like
Yeah.
that. I just want to see if you would comment on land prices. You kind of alluded to
Yeah.
demand with ethanol and higher commodity prices. When's this bubble going to pop?
Yeah, well, I'm very interested you said that way, because since I do a lot of work in the financial and economic area, I often am talking about sort of monetary policies and similar things. And one of the indicators that I use of increasing risks was farmland prices in the United States. And my contact with this was a few years ago when I was at the World Bank. When I could, I sometimes try to stop at the regional Federal Reserve banks because they have very good economic staff and they focus on the regional economy. So I was at the Kansas City Fed, and I asked them, this is a couple years ago, I said, well, what are you watching? They said farmland prices, because farmland prices were higher in real terms than they were in the late 70s. And one of the other things I dealt with in my life was the crash of the farm credit system and the restructuring of that. And so leverage wasn't as high as it was in that time period, but rental prices and others are kind of building in some rather sort of bold assumptions. I was speaking to the CEO of one of the major investment banks that has managed to fare relatively well, and he said, oh yeah, we invested in farmland a few years ago, we're not getting out of it. So I don't know if that gives you some caution. But I think, really this is related to the rather unusual monetary policies, which was very hard to read going forward. And I'm not trying to be critical of what's been done so far. What I'm trying to suggest is that we have to anticipate some of the unanticipated consequences, whether they be asset price bubbles or whether they be effect on savers that move to sort of riskier products, whether it's effect on some of the developing economies, because we don't want, in dealing with one set of problems, to plant the seeds of another crisis. And just again, to share you an anecdote, central bankers show their face to the world as they're confident about these things. Well, one of the major central bankers, and not from the US, was a friend of mine, and I was asking about these issues, and he said, look, when you sort of step away from all the quantitative mathematical analysis, he said, what monetary policy does is it tries to shift some demand from the future and bring it forward to kind of smooth out the cycle. He said, but after 5 years, he said, we're not smoothing out a cycle, we're digging a very big hole. Okay? So I'd put this in the context of something else that Mitch and I have talked about. When you're in these points, and maybe you have to do what you have to do, but one should certainly be alert to trying to minimize other risks going forward. So the fact that we have not taken on entitlement issues, and even with some of the spending cuts or tax increases, we're not dealing with the fundamentals of the entitlements. That's a big risk factor for the United States out there. And so, as we think about some of the potential ways of dealing with these issues, there are steps that the hot term now in financial supervision word is macroprudential policies. There's ways you can use regulatory systems to try to deal with some of these issues of farmland prices. But it's a very good example of, you kind of push in one place and you get another effect, and you better be trying to think about it.
Have one down here on the aisle.
Yes, Jim Zink, and also an Ag Econ graduate. But you had commented earlier briefly on the price subsidies and farm supports, or vice versa, price supports and farm subsidies. What are the prospects, in your opinion, of getting any changes in that regard?
I think I should defer that to a former director of OMB. One of the reasons that Mitch has never forgiven me is when he was trying to, I shouldn't say this in Indiana and the Midwest, but when he was trying to deal with the budget issues, he was looking for places that he could slow the rate of growth, we'll say. And he said, gee, if you could negotiate a trade agreement that cuts farm subsidies, that would be a good thing. So, well, I haven't looked as close at the new Farm Bill, but I guess I think that while the higher prices obviously remove some of the needs, the subsidies have, by and large, the policies remain somewhat generous. There is some shift, as I understand it, but people here would know better, to various types of crop insurance and other models. Those tend to be pretty subsidized too, because as I was looking towards what I think is a justifiable policy of crop insurance in emerging markets or others, you still need to try to get the incentives right. And I was somewhat concerned that actually within the trade policy. John mentioned this morning, that these might actually kind of violate some of the categories that the United States had negotiated. And so at the time we're trying to get others to reduce barriers, we may not be doing so well on our own. So I guess in the short term, I haven't been extremely sanguine, but I guess one of the reasons that I've made the broader comments that I've done is that I think over time there's going to be a lot more pressures on all these spending. And therefore it's important to try to understand the policy shifts and imperative so you can offer the protections that you need, but in a way that is more efficient and lower costs to the overall system. And look, we come back, if we don't get on top of this entitlements issue, the so-called discretionary spending, which includes farm subsidies, all that's going to just get squeezed more and more and more. And so one of the challenges is that in making policy in the United States is whether people can anticipate enough. This issue will really come home to roost not even in 5 years or 10 years, but beyond that. And you're just not going to be able to support some of the pension assumptions. But if we acted now, you could make small, gradual changes that would be sort of huge in effect. And by the way, back to the question about sort of farmland, the other issue is related to these monetary policies. If you talk to a CEO of an insurance company and they've got long-term liabilities, and what is their return that they're getting to match this? So the same thing if you think about pensions and what people's expectations are for pensions, this is going to be a question too. But what would you say about farm policy?
What you said. Can't improve on it. No, I mean, the gap between pension assumptions and pension reality has probably never been as high as it is right now. At least from what I've seen, very few pension funds have, at least public ones, have faced up and have adjusted to this interest rate environment that we're in. We have time for one more, and I think let's have this one over. Oh, sorry, you already had it, Mike. We'll have two more.
Ben Gramig, Agricultural Economics Department here. You mentioned the importance of climate change several times in your remarks this morning as well as this afternoon, and then you also mentioned the importance of this entitlements issue and thinking about domestic policy and spending. I wonder if you might speak to the issue of addressing climate change at home in the U.S. and not thinking about necessarily those international negotiations and what that implies in terms of the costs, the upfront costs, and the long-range prospect for realizing benefits.
Well, the start is, and I tend to, just because of my experience, I tend to look at this with some global numbers. I was struck by the energy subsidies globally. There's work that the World Bank did, OECD, there was an IMF report on this. So we worked with McKinsey to kind of do sort of a cost curve of different steps that would have reduction of carbon. We talked about farm subsidies. The energy subsidies globally dwarf the farm subsidies. I mean, so there's a whole win-win prospect sort of right there in terms of being able to use energy more efficiently and sort of produce less carbon. I think in terms of kind of the U.S. system, the battle lines have been, in my view, a little too sharply drawn. The way these things normally work is that sometimes it'll take a sort of a combination of sort of time, people trying to find some win-win opportunities, whether it be sort of energy efficiency. There's been a win-win opportunity here in the use of natural gas. So if you look at the sort of decrease in greenhouse gas emissions of the United States sort of compared to others. All I can really, there's no one formula on that. All I can kind of point to is that I found we live in a constitutional democracy. You got to have room for different views here. Is that if people become sort of holier than thou or sanctimonious or theological about this, it'll be very hard to find some common ground. And I'm sorry if that sounds pragmatic, but I say this as somebody, I've often been somebody who tries to bridge the gap on some of these issues, whether it be environmental or some of the other topics. And I sometimes get a little frustrated because I try to bring along some people on the center-right side that may be a little bit more resistant. And it's often tough when you try to do that and you get people that will just be no holds barred from the other point of view. So that's why, again, in almost going back to the question in Cancun, I look for things like, whether with forestation, avoided deforestation, energy efficiency, sort of different technology advances. What can we try to do that one of the professors again said, while there's high degrees of uncertainty about there is a form of insurance and risk policy. So that's the best that I could suggest in trying to approach this in the U.S. I guess because this fits in an international context, it also goes back to my point that I think, whether people use it as an excuse or whether it's their true logic, if they feel that any reduction that they have in carbon in the United States and the costs that they have to pay for it is eaten up by somebody else in the world, well, then you're going to have a hard time doing it. So that's where it goes back to the idea, if you could try to get the 20 to 30 major economies to agree to and maybe they'll do it at different stages, an overall approach and reduction, I think you have a better chance of dealing with some of the domestic sensitivities. But having said that, we can look at it two ways. One is, I'm not going to fool you. I think this is still going to be a difficult slog to go through. And secondly, however, is let's take immigration. Immigration was an issue a couple years ago that people thought was going to be impossible to tackle. And it could come together now. And by the way, as we talk about some of the pensions and other aspects, one of the things that distinguishes the United States is not only the demographics, but with immigration, that could be a big help. And frankly, I think it's one of the things that distinguishes the United States as a country, is being open to ideas and capital and trade and people, and goodness knows your university is part of that. So, sometimes, I'll close with this thought. Sometimes people, look at the American constitutional system and they get all frustrated and they talk about impasse in Washington, and there's a fair amount of that. But keep in mind, this Constitution was designed by people with the idea that it wasn't just supposed to be so easy. And that's partly because it was supposed to limit the ability of a government that supposedly has a brilliant idea that goes and does something and might end up kind of overreaching. And it basically tried to give the private sector the idea that it was supposed to be the sort of genius of America. But I think at the same time that we have that type of constitutional system, you can make it work. I mean, and Mitch and I are talking, there's different things that you've seen, different types of leaders can make it work. I do believe that ultimately the president in this system has a particularly important role. Just because Congress alone is not going to drive these things. And the question is, whether the president, and I'm not just saying President Obama, I'm saying it's true for any president, can try to get a critical mass to kind of get something done for the country that isn't necessarily 100% of what he or she would want, but kind of moves the ball forward. I see that possibly in immigration now. I wish I could see it in tax reform and entitlements.
I want to close by congratulating this audience and I guess the department because this is one of those rare question and answer sessions where people actually asked questions. Wasn't a single burst of extended oratory in the group, and therefore we covered a lot of ground, and thank you and congratulations, and thank you, Bob Zoellich. You talk about someone who has a life track record of making things work, sometimes under the most difficult, apparently intractable circumstances, and it's this gentleman here. And it remains my fond hope that the nation having called on him again and again and again, we got at least one more call somewhere out there for him to answer, because if so, some of these excellent questions and issues that were raised will be advanced. That's been his past, and I hope it will be his future. Join me in thanking one of America's great public servants.
Mr. Zoellich, could I ask you to join me here at the podium real quick? We greatly appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to spend some time with us. Your insights are incredibly valuable and insightful, and I'm sure the students, faculty, and staff here at Purdue have enjoyed their interactions with you today, and we appreciate that. It's important to us to have person of your stature come here and educate us. So one of the things that Benjamin Franklin said, tell me and I forget, teach me and I remember, involve me and I learn. So it's been a pleasure having you involve us in your life, and I know we've learned a lot. We hope you'll remember your Purdue experience, and just to make sure, we've got a small token of appreciation for you.
Thank you. Can I open it?
Oh, please do.
Oh, fantastic. So we going to try it on?
Oh, if you wish.
Sure. You know, I was out running this morning. It was a little dark because I know some governor changed the daylight savings time. And the one thing I was thinking of was I said, you know, this black and gold stuff looks really good, but it's a little tricky in the dark. So you guys are going to have to draw on the gold a little bit more. So anyway, so thank you. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Just as a reminder, we're going to adjourn now, but at 3:30 we'll re-adjourn in the Cranard Auditorium for a small award ceremony and then a short reception afterward. Let's show our appreciation again to Mr. Zoellich. All right. Yes.
Thank you. It's a very thoughtful gift.
Oh.